In November 1558, England gained a new monarch and a new problem. Elizabeth Tudor, 25 years old, unmarried, and childless, stepped into the role of queen with the weight of a dynasty balanced on a very thin thread. Her accession was met not with jubilation alone, but also with a bit of calculation. Those who had survived the rapid-fire shifts of power under Henry VIII, Edward VI, and Jane Grey's 9 days, as well as Mary I, had learned one lesson very clearly. A crown without a clear next heir was not a blessing, it was a fuse. The memory of 1553 still lingered. Edward VI had barely been in his grave before two rival queens, Jane Grey and Mary Tudor, had raised standards in their names. Armies had marched, proclamations were issued and revoked, and ordinary people had been forced to declare where their loyalties lay before the dust had even settled on Edward's tomb. Nobody wanted a repeat performance, especially not with the added complication of foreign powers now watching England's throne with more interest than ever. Yet, from her very first council meetings, Elizabeth made one thing very clear. She would not name an heir. The succession question was not an administrative matter, it was leverage, and she intended to keep it close. Almost immediately, whispers began moving through court chambers and family estates alike. If Elizabeth died suddenly, who then was next? 3 names rose again and again: Lady Katherine Grey, Henry Hastings, Earl of Huntingdon, and Mary Queen of Scots. Each had a different claim, each was backed by a different faction, each was waiting for the crown's silence to break. Hello and welcome back to the Renaissance English History Podcast, the original Tudor history podcast telling stories of Tudor England since 2009. I am your host, Heather, and I am, as always, just delighted, thrilled, ecstatic that you are here with me today to talk about the heirs of Elizabeth I, especially very early in her reign. So we're going to talk about those early years, say up until the mid-1560s, and who the presumed heirs were when people hadn't yet got used to the fact that their queen was not going to marry, and everyone was very concerned about what was going to happen if she had perished, and the main names that were thrown around and considered. So let's get into it. To understand why these 3 names rose above the others, it's necessary to go back and look at the paperwork left behind by Henry VIII. In 1544, Parliament passed the Third Succession Act, reaffirming the rights of Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, to inherit after their brother Edward. But it also granted the king an unusual power, the right to designate the succession beyond his children. Henry's final will, confirmed before witnesses and sealed with the Great Seal, did exactly that. After his own children, he named the heirs of his younger sister, Mary Tudor, through her daughters, Frances Brandon and Eleanor Brandon. That meant that the Brandon descendants, the Grey sisters through Frances, and the Hastings line through Eleanor, were legally next in line. Conspicuously absent were the descendants of Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's older sister, whose line had merged with the Scottish crown through James IV and James V. By leaving them out, Henry effectively declared that the throne of England should remain distinctly English, not fall into Scottish or worse French influence. This created a split in logic that would define Elizabeth's reign: English law versus dynastic blood. By statute, Katherine Grey and Henry Hastings were legitimate successors. By lineage and international recognition, Mary, Queen of Scots, had the superior claim. So Elizabeth inherited a throne and also a legal contradiction, and around that contradiction, power began to gather. If one were to follow Henry VIII's will to the letter, Lady Katherine Grey should have been the most obvious heir to Elizabeth. She was the granddaughter of Mary Tudor, Henry's beloved younger sister, through her daughter Frances Brandon. On parchment, it looked very neat and settled, but in reality, her claim was wrapped in discomfort, scandal, and bitter memory. The Grey family had not yet recovered from its most infamous moment, the 9-day reign and execution of Lady Jane Grey, Catherine's older sister. Jane's brief and tragic brush with the crown had turned the Grey name into a warning. Her death in 1554, carried out by Mary I after Wyatt's rebellion, created a Protestant martyr figure and a ghost that haunted Elizabeth's early reign. To acknowledge Catherine too openly as heir would not just raise a lawful successor, it would resurrect Jane. The other issue with Katherine Grey is that there were mutters that Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, her grandfather, had technically still been married to Anne Brown when he married Mary Tudor. The legality of that union was later resolved, but in an age obsessed with marriage contracts and sacrament, the whisper of illegitimacy clung to the Brandon Grey line just enough to make things uncomfortable. Catherine's fortunes under Mary I were far more favorable than many might have expected. Despite the consequences of her sister Jane Grey's brief reign and tragic end, Mary didn't hold Catherine responsible. She served at court, she attended key ceremonies, she was one of the chief ladies in waiting, and most notably, she acted as chief mourner at Mary's funeral. Catherine was treated with every respect as one of the Queen's blood, a recognition of her place in the royal hierarchy. This ceremonial role physically placed Catherine at the head of the mourning procession, signaling to ambassadors and courtiers alike that she ranked highly among the surviving Tudor women. But everything shifted once Elizabeth ascended to the throne. Where Mary had included Catherine, Elizabeth conspicuously diminished her status. At Elizabeth's earliest court celebration, Catherine was positioned behind women of lower birth, a visible sign of Elizabeth's intention to lessen her profile. De Feria reported to Spain that the Queen does not favor Lady Catherine and keeps her at a distance, which kind of sums up Elizabeth's chilly treatment. Elizabeth's unease with Catherine was deeply personal as well as political. Catherine represented lawful succession and the potential for producing heirs. Elizabeth, unmarried, constantly pressured on the matter of marriage and succession, found her cousin's fertility and royal legitimacy a pointed contrast. Ambassadorial letters over these years often speculated on the likelihood that God might provide England with another heir if Elizabeth did not marry, a sentiment echoed in multiple reports, though not always in those exact words. Diplomatic observers saw that Elizabeth's mood soured when Catherine was mentioned in court discussions. Venetian and papal envoys described the Queen's coldness and dismissals of Catherine. In Tudor politics, even a smile could signal exclusion, and Elizabeth's polite gestures were frequently understood to mask deeper reservations. Though Catherine herself rarely took an active political role, her passive position made her an ideal object of political schemes and plotting. Catherine's role became significantly more controversial in 1560 and 61 when she secretly married Edward Seymour, son of the former Protector Somerset and nephew of Jane Seymour. Both brought powerful dynastic claims. Their union was politically dangerous and performed without Elizabeth's permission, which was tantamount to treason at that point. When Catherine was discovered to be pregnant, all hell basically broke loose. De Feria's dispatches recorded concern that Lady Catherine grows great with child, and the court murmurs that she will give England what the Queen has not. Elizabeth's response was immediate and severe. Upon discovering Catherine's secret marriage, Elizabeth ordered both of them to be imprisoned in the Tower, where they were kept apart. Catherine actually gave birth to her first son, Edward Seymour, in the Tower in September 1561. Despite the harsh conditions, the couple managed to meet secretly, resulting in Catherine's second pregnancy. Her second son, Thomas, was born there in 1563. But then, due to outbreaks of the plague in London, they were placed under house arrest. Catherine was kept in the custody of her uncle, Lord John Grey, at Pergo in Essex, while Edward was confined elsewhere. These births were quite the discussion topic because each one represented a potential Tudor heir born without the Queen's consent. Now let's talk about Henry Hastings, the Earl of Huntingdon, the Protestants' candidate. If Katherine Grey represented the legal heir and Mary Stuart the glamorous dynastic threat, Henry Hastings, 3rd Earl of Huntingdon, stood for something far more measured, a controlled future shaped by counsel rather than crown. He wasn't a man of charisma or a romantic speculation. He wasn't a superstar. To many observers, though, that was precisely his strength. Hastings was descended from George, Duke of Clarence, brother to Edward IV and Richard III, the Yorkist line that was older than the Tudors themselves. In a court that still remembered Bosworth and the usurpation of Richard III, that bloodline stirred quiet interest. An Italian observer noted with wry amusement that some in England still speak of the House of York in a lower voice as if it might rise again. Hastings never invoked that lineage himself, but it hovered behind him like an ancestral banner. He had built a reputation as serious, pious, and disciplined. The Spanish ambassador, who reported on the personal habits of the English nobility with cutting precision, described Hastings as the most virtuous of lords, a sober man who seeks to offend no party. It wasn't a compliment as much as a warning. Hastings was clean, and clean men were hard to discredit. His household at Ashby-de-la-Zouch was run with almost Puritan severity. There was a lack of pageantry. It was seen as a godly house where they dined more on scripture than on luxury. To Protestant reformers like Cecil, that actually made him an ideal successor, staunch in faith yet politically cautious. He could be trusted to maintain the Protestant settlement without flamboyance or foreign entanglement that Mary Stuart embodied. There were factional advantages, too. Hastings had married Katherine Dudley, sister of Robert Dudley, Elizabeth's favorite and true love. That alliance made Protestants hopeful that, should Elizabeth die without issue, Dudley, and by extension Cecil's council, might rule through a pliant Huntingdon. One French report put it bluntly: if this earl were king, England should be governed by those who made him. Unlike Katherine Grey or Mary Stuart, Hastings drew no emotional commentary. Ambassadors didn't describe him as dangerous or tragic. Instead, they called him safe. Importantly, Hastings never openly lobbied for his own claim. That aloofness actually helped him. Katherine Grey had married dangerously. Mary Stuart had let France proclaim her Queen of England. Hastings, by contrast, appeared modest and controllable. He just kept his head down. He served Elizabeth loyally and let other men whisper on his behalf. People generally thought that he was a safe bet who would do little harm, which sounded like a salvation. He offered loyalty without ambition, which made him useful to powerful men who preferred a monarch who could reign by counsel, not personal will. No songs were written about Henry Hastings, no romantic plots spiraled around his name. But while the court gossiped about Grey and trembled at Mary Stuart, the Protestant establishment kept his name quietly polished, ready to bring forward if Elizabeth left England without an heir and without direction. So Henry Hastings represents the quiet Protestant insurance policy. And then Mary, Queen of Scots, was the exact opposite. There was nothing modest or quiet about her. While Hastings' name appeared in council calculations and Protestant contingency planning, Mary's name rang across Europe like a challenge. Hastings was described by ambassadors as harmless. Mary was spoken of in terms of destiny. To many outside England, she wasn't a possible heir. She was the rightful Queen of England, waiting only for God or politics to remove Elizabeth. Mary was the granddaughter of Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's older sister, and unlike the Grey or Hastings claim, her lineage could be traced in a straight, unbroken line from a lawful Tudor marriage. More importantly, she was already a crowned queen, an anointed monarch of Scotland since infancy. And for a brief window, her claim seemed unstoppable. As wife to Francis II of France, she stood poised to become Queen of France, Queen of Scotland, and, in French eyes, Queen of England. From the moment Elizabeth took the throne, French coinage and court ceremony began referring to Mary as Queen of England. It was an insult recorded with alarm in English diplomatic letters. The Spanish ambassador observed that the French speak more of the Scottish queen's right than of their own king's glory, noting Mary's claim had become a rallying cry, not just a legal argument. Mary herself understood the value of spectacle. She cultivated image and presence, something neither Katherine Grey or Henry Hastings ever did. She was described as graceful, learned, and exceedingly conscious of her station. Her letters to Elizabeth were outwardly courteous, but always written from one sovereign to another, not from a supplicant or a dependent. The Bishop of Ross, Mary's representative, noted that she would never address the Queen of England as a lesser, but always as one equal born. And the Spanish ambassador de Quadra reported that Elizabeth fears that the Scottish queen carries herself too like a queen of all realms. Mary asked repeatedly for a personal meeting with Elizabeth, hoping to secure recognition or at least a public statement confirming her place in the succession. Elizabeth always delayed, evaded, or redirected. The two queens would never meet, and religion only sharpened the divide. Mary was Catholic, tied to the powerful Guise faction in France. And then Elizabeth made a move that turned Mary's court ice cold. She sent aid to the Huguenots, the Protestant rebels fighting Mary's French relatives. It was seen as a deliberate act of hostility that ended any hope of diplomatic warmth between them. At the time, it was believed that the Scottish queen would never forgive the English aid to heretics. And Mary seemed to believe that the Queen of England was making war upon her very blood. Mary's presence in European politics had real emotional charge. Where Hastings inspired caution and Catherine inspired uneasy sympathy, Mary stirred passion, hope among Catholics, dread among Protestants, and a dangerous fascination in between. Foreign envoys didn't ask if she would make a move on England, they asked when. And when Elizabeth played her long game of ambiguity and delay, Mary's claim gathered momentum outside her control. A train already moving, powered by crowns, churches, and rumor. So then let's talk about a minor player, which is Lady Lennox, Margaret Douglas. Katherine Grey was languishing under her house arrest. Henry Hastings remained a quiet contingency. There was a fourth presence, hovering at the edges of the succession question. Not an official heir, not yet dangerous, but unmistakably alert to opportunity. And that would be Margaret Douglas, Countess of Lennox, the daughter of Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's older sister by her second marriage to Archibald Douglas, the Earl of Angus. That birth gave her a direct Tudor bloodline. She was first cousins with Elizabeth I, and unlike Mary Stuart, she lived in England, watched the court daily, and studied Elizabeth with the cold patience of someone who believed fortune could still turn in her favor. She had spent time in the Tower under both Henry VIII and Mary I, usually for overreaching in marriage politics. She had a secret marriage in the summer of 1536 that was portrayed very vividly in Wolf Hall. I actually did several videos on that secret marriage on my YouTube channel, so I won't go back and go through all of the details right now. She fell in love and had this secret liaison with Lord Thomas Howard, a younger son in the powerful Howard family. And Henry VIII was very upset about that, punished them both severely. Thomas Howard actually died in the Tower because of that liaison, that relationship. So Margaret Douglas was no stranger to marriage politics. Her son, Henry Darnley, was the product of deliberate dynastic pairing. Of course, his mother had direct Tudor blood as the daughter of Margaret Tudor, and then his father, Matthew Stuart, Earl of Lennox, descended from James II of Scotland, making Darnley a Stuart prince by birth. In him, two royal lines met, Tudor and Stuart, and Margaret raised him with full awareness that this made him uniquely viable. Unlike Mary Stuart, Darnley had been born in England, raised speaking the language of the English court, and could be presented as a domestic Tudor heir rather than a foreign Catholic monarch. Elizabeth recognized immediately that Margaret Douglas was raising a marriageable male heir who could, if matched with Mary Stuart, unite the Scottish and English succession claim into one bloodline. This wasn't an official claim, it was more just like a threat that was just out there, just kind of floating in the wind. So from the moment she took the throne, Elizabeth ruled not just as a queen, but as the single barrier between order and another succession crisis. She understood immediately that naming an heir would create more danger than security. The moment one candidate was acknowledged, every other faction would rally against them, and England would once again fracture into competing loyalties. So Elizabeth employed ambiguity as policy. When Katherine Grey produced 2 sons in captivity, Elizabeth refused to see them, and foreign ambassadors reported that she would not even speak their names. To acknowledge them was to make them real. Catherine existed, but politically she was treated as something closer to a legal problem than a living kinswoman. Henry Hastings, meanwhile, was kept close to court but never elevated. He received positions of responsibility without influence, present but neutralized. Cecil and the Protestant council kept him quietly positioned like a spare key, useful only if all else failed. Hastings was allowed proximity but never a platform. Mary, Queen of Scots, was handled with distance. Elizabeth delayed every request for a meeting, drawing it out with polite deferrals, keeping Mary always in motion but never in reach. When foreign diplomats pressed her, Elizabeth issued the same careful line, "I know no heir but the one God shall send me." It was less a statement of faith than a weaponized refusal, a way to shut down conversation without giving anything away. By refusing to designate a successor, Elizabeth turned every potential heir into a figure of uncertainty rather than legitimacy. Katherine Grey became a prisoner, not an heir. Hastings became a possibility, never a promise. And Mary Stuart became a threat, not a certainty. This was Elizabeth's strategy, and it kept her throne firmly hers. By the early 1560s, none of these 3 main heirs were advancing, and also none were disappearing. Katherine Grey was still sat in confinement, still producing Tudor sons out of sight. Henry Hastings was moving with silent discipline through the court, useful but deliberately unexciting. And Mary Stuart circled from Scotland, her letters gracious but edged like a blade. Everyone was waiting for Elizabeth to move first, and she never did. That stillness became its own form of pressure. As the 1560s unfolded, the succession question became less about ambition and more about endurance. Each potential heir remained in play, but none with momentum. Katherine Grey was turning into a quiet tragedy. Shut away, her children were growing up as political inconveniences rather than princely assets. She had done what a Tudor woman was meant to do. She had produced heirs, and for that she was punished. Henry Hastings continued to serve Elizabeth with faultless loyalty, neither favored nor dismissed, existing in that strange limbo reserved for men who are useful so long as they never ask for more. His house remained orderly, his reputation spotless, which made him seem almost too perfect, too managed, a spare monarch waiting in a cupboard, never taken out. And Mary, Queen of Scots, was the heir of conversations, of rumors, of foreign correspondence, a queen who could not step onto English soil without changing the entire game. Through it all, Elizabeth outlasted the tension by refusing to blink. The court held its breath, and she never exhaled. Looking back, it's tempting to see all 3 of them, Catherine, Henry, Mary, Queen of Scots, as pieces in a game that Elizabeth had already won. But in the first years of her reign, nothing felt secure, and none of them knew how long Elizabeth would live or whether England would once again be thrown into frantic allegiance-making at the death of a monarch. They waited in their prison, council chamber, foreign courts, while Elizabeth mastered the art of ruling by absence, keeping the future deliberately unwritten. Catherine died in custody, Hastings faded into dutiful obscurity, and Mary walked straight into the tragedy that would end on the scaffold at Fotheringhay. In the end, none of them wore the crown that they circled. The question that haunted the 1560s, who comes after Elizabeth, would be answered not by any of those early heirs, but a child born outside of this story in the next generation entirely. So there we have it, a little bit on the uneasiness of the presumed heirs in the 1560s. All right, my friend, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I hope you enjoyed this and learned something. If you would like to leave a comment, I do always enjoy looking at those wherever you're listening to this. That would be lovely. And if you enjoyed it, I sure would appreciate a press of a like button, again, wherever you're listening to this. Thank you so much for being here and for spending this time with me, my friend. As always, you can find me in the Tudor Learning Circle, tudorlearningscircle.com, a social network just for Tudor history fans. I do hang out in there, and I love connecting with you all. All right, my friend, thank you again for being here. I will be back very, very soon. Have an amazing week. Bye-bye.
Blow, northern wind, a scent full Mary sweating, blow. boord in Bouwrebriek, dat solis semlis onzicht, mens gevoel meiden of me.